another Healthy Bite. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, this week I had the pleasure of talking to Roger Price. Roger's been a guest on the podcast before, and Roger is a health advocate and educator with over 60 years of experience in the functional medicine space, and for the last 20 or 30 years has been particularly focused on breathing and breathing retraining. It was a great opportunity to review what breathing is, why we do it, and why it's so important. And we also discussed asthma. And there were two terms that he reminded me of. One of those terms is called idiopathic, and idiopathic relates to, I'm just quoting here, or denoting any disease or condition which arises spontaneously for which the cause is unknown. And idiopathic is often used to describe asthma. There's a genetic component, obviously, and there's an environmental component. But some people are more susceptible than others, and idiopathic is when you really don't know what the cause of the disease is. And another term that I thought was worth mentioning, because he touched on it as well, and that is the term iatrogenic. And iatrogenic relates to illnesses caused by medical examination or treatment. And Roger actually pointed out that the examination, the diagnosis for asthma, actually almost guarantees that you may well you be diagnosed with it when you may not have it at all. So iatrogenic and idiopathic are two names which can often be associated with asthma. It's also interesting to use asthma as an example of a condition which is often misdiagnosed. I think Professor Pete Smith a few weeks ago mentioned that 30% of asthma sufferers are misdiagnosed. They actually do not have asthma. Roger upped the ante on that by suggesting that it was up to 90% in his clinical experience. Whether it's 30 or 90%, it's a lot of people that are misdiagnosed with asthma. And what's so interesting about this is that the solution for managing asthma, and we're talking about managing it, we're never talking about curing it, is pharmaceutical intervention. And Roger shared with us some stories of what we used in the 1970s and particularly popularised in New Zealand, a thing called phenetranol, which actually resulted in many deaths. And it was being used for about 6 or 7 years in New Zealand. And when it was discontinued, then those deaths reduced significantly. And I think it was a really interesting example of a pharmaceutical product which is approved, used in the community, causes unnecessary deaths, and then is eventually removed. And the reason that's significant is because so many pharmaceutical products have a similar effect. And I'm just going to draw your attention to a couple, like Pradaxa. Pradaxa was another pharmaceutical introduced by Boehringer Ingelheim, and that's a pharmaceutical company that Roger references away. Again, Pradaxa is an example of an anticoagulant, which was FDA approved. Actually caused 60,000 deaths before it was taken off the market, but it was FDA approved, and there it is. Oxycontin. Now, Oxycontin is a painkiller, which the FDA, it's actually an opioid, and the FDA and the company Purdue, the pharmaceutical company Purdue, convinced the FDA to put a label on it which said it is not addictive. Now, every doctor knows that one of the features of opioids are that they are addictive, but somehow Purdue convinced the FDA that Oxycontin wasn't addictive, and that has resulted in over 500,000 deaths. I think it may be up to 600,000. And the deaths was tragic enough, but the impact that this had on communities and on individuals who were still alive was huge. So There is another example of a pharmaceutical industry working in tandem with the FDA to gain approval for its medication. And that went on for over 10 years. Over 10 years. And if you want to see how Big Pharma operates, I would recommend that you look at a program called Dope Sick, which is a 6-part miniseries. Michael Keaton is a doctor I think in Kentucky. He's a rural doctor who himself becomes addicted to Oxycontin, but the devastation that this drug caused with FDA approval was huge. Depakote, another one for epilepsy by Abbott Laboratories. That caused birth defects, and they knew it caused birth defects, but they suppressed the information on that. Vioxx, an anti-inflammatory made by Merck, the makers of molnupiravir, caused 60,000 deaths, which eventually saw it being taken off, but it was on the market for a good 5 or 10 years. Another drug called Avandia, which is from GlaxoSmithKline or SmithKline, was another one that actually was a diabetes drug, and the problem with that diabetes drug, and again, it got FDA approval, was that 50% of people who took it developed cardiovascular disease, and 20% of people who took it went on to die. So I use these examples, and there are many others. Let's not forget that the world's biggest drug maker, Pfizer, was fined $2.3 billion in 2010. It was the biggest criminal fine in US history. Pfizer, I think that's a name many of you will be familiar with, was fined for healthcare fraud and illegal marketing. Now, I've mentioned this before, but actually the pharmaceutical industry has been fined something like $70 billion over the last 20 years. That's an average of $3.5 billion a year. That would be enough to finish any industry off. But when you've got revenues of $1.2 trillion, that's just petty cash. And I mention these because it's an example of when we put our trust in pharmaceutical industry. And who are the major stakeholders in the pharmaceutical industry? Well, they are shareholders. And a company's fiduciary responsibility is to return as high a profit to its shareholders as possible. And any follower of the pharmaceutical industry over the last 2 years will know that this period has been nirvana for Big Pharma. If a pharmaceutical company can get sales of $1 billion, that constitutes what they call in pharmaceutical industry a blockbuster drug. Examples of blockbuster drugs are Lipitor, a statin. Another one is Nexium, that is a protein pump inhibitor for acid reflux and heartburn and indigestion. Antidepressants, there are quite a few blockbuster drugs that have generated more than $1 billion worth of sales. Well, guess what? The Pfizer have hit the jackpot because in, I think, 6 months, they generated $39 billion worth of sales. $39 billion. Moderna, a company that was facing financial ruin prior to the pandemic, registered something like $16 billion worth of sales. So there are drug companies that's why I call it nirvana for Big Pharma. And not only that, but they have governments actually marketing on their behalf. And you may know many people who unwittingly have become marketing and compliance officers for the pharmaceutical industry, feeling vitriolic about anybody who doesn't vaccinate their children over the age of 5 or themselves, or having gone back for boosters. This is one of the reasons why I think we need to approach this whole vaccination story, but medications in general, but vaccinations in particular, with caution, because the pharmaceutical industry are not focused on public health. They are focused on profit. And we are reminded of that in this discussion this week on asthma and the pharmaceutical interventions which are used to manage a disease which has been misdiagnosed somewhere between 30 and 90%. It's also a great discussion about why nasal breathing is important and mouth breathing, compared to breathing through your mouth. I think it's an episode well worth watching, but I wanted to really draw your attention to it because it was such a great example of A, misdiagnosis, B, the management of a chronic disease without any cure that generates billions of dollars worth of profits for the pharmaceutical industry. And also it allows doctors to be seen to be doing something for idiopathic conditions for which we really are not sure about the cause of. But if we go back to the basics of anatomy, biochemistry, physiology, if we understand nutritional and environmental medicine as triggers for these conditions, then we can do a far better job of managing disease and enjoying good health. If, on the other hand, your preference is to take the medications, don't worry about it. You've got an industry waiting there with open arms to embrace you and manage you through your life. But if you're listening to this podcast, I doubt whether you fall into that category. And at this point, I might also mention that we have some exciting things in Unstress Health, which is a whole new platform that takes our message to another level. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.